Hit subscribe now and never miss out. Don't forget to leave a comment after watching the video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Your feedback means the world to me. It all started with an urban legend I overheard at a cafe near Alexanderplatz. Berliners are full of stories, but this one was different. Two students at the next table whispered about a station that only appears on certain nights. They called it Geisterbahnhof, the ghost station. "It's not on any map," one of them said. "And if you get off there," the other added, glancing over their shoulder, "you never come back the same." I laughed it off at first, but something about the way they spoke sent a shiver down my spine. Their voices lowered as they described how commuters on the U-Bahn, the underground train system, would find themselves on an unfamiliar train late at night. The train would stop at a station with no name, no passengers waiting, and no way back. Despite the absurdity of it, I couldn't shake the story. That night, I scoured forums and blogs, searching for anything about the so-called ghost station. To my surprise, there were accounts, dozens of them. Most were vague and riddled with typos, but the theme was the same: an unplanned stop on a train that wasn't supposed to be there. Some described flickering lights and the faint sound of a woman crying. Others mentioned a clock frozen at 3:13 a.m. and the overwhelming smell of damp earth. Each story ended with the same warning: if the train stops, don't get off. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? Just a bit of Berlin folklore to spice up the city's history. But deep down, a part of me wanted to believe it. Or maybe I just wanted to prove it was all nonsense. That's how I found myself at the U-Bahn station at midnight a week later, waiting for a train I hoped didn't exist. The station was unusually quiet for a Friday night. A few late-night commuters sat on benches, staring at their phones or dozing off. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting an unnatural yellow glow over the tiled walls. I stood near the edge of the platform, my hands stuffed into my coat pockets to fight off the chill. The clock above ticked closer to midnight. Despite my resolve to prove the ghost station was a myth, I couldn't ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Every creak of the tracks, every gust of air rushing through the tunnel made my pulse quicken. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the first train arrived. Its brakes screeched as it came to a halt, and the doors hissed open. I scanned the interior from where I stood, but it was an ordinary train, brightly lit, half empty, and filled with tired passengers. I let it pass. The next train came at 12:15 a.m. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. I stayed rooted to the spot, ignoring the impatient looks from the station guard. By 12:30, the platform was empty. The night felt heavier somehow, the air colder. The buzzing of the lights above seemed louder now, grating against my nerves. I glanced at the clock again. Time crawled, each second stretching longer than it should. Then at 12:47 a.m. I heard it, the faint sound of an approaching train. But this one was different. The rumble of the tracks sounded wrong, uneven, as though the train were struggling against the weight of time itself. The train pulled into view, and I instinctively stepped back. The cars were darker than usual, their windows smudged and opaque. The lights inside flickered, revealing only shadows of passengers sitting unnaturally still. The doors slid open with a creak. A cold draft wafted out, carrying a faint metallic smell, like rust and decay. I hesitated. This was it, the ghost train. My instinct screamed at me to walk away, but curiosity held me in place. Slowly, I stepped forward, peering into the nearest car. The shadows inside didn't move, didn't breathe. Something unseen tugged at me, drawing me closer. Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the train. The doors closed behind me with a final hiss, sealing my fate. The moment the doors slid shut, the world outside vanished. I glanced out of the window, expecting to see the familiar tiled walls of the station, but there was nothing, just an endless, impenetrable blackness. My stomach churned as the train lurched forward with a groan, the sound echoing in the eerie silence. Inside the car, the flickering lights made it difficult to see clearly. The air was heavy and cold, carrying the same metallic tang I'd noticed earlier. The seats were dusty and worn, as though they hadn't been used in decades. And then there were the passengers. I counted 5 of them, each sitting motionless in their seats. Their heads were bowed and their faces obscured by shadows. None of them reacted to my presence. They didn't shift, didn't glance up, didn't even breathe. "Excuse me," I said hesitantly, my voice barely a whisper. No response. I tried again, louder this time. Still, nothing. It was as if they were statues, frozen in time. A chill crept up my spine, but I forced myself to move down the aisle, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. As I passed each passenger, I couldn't shake the feeling that their heads turned slightly, ever so slightly, to follow me. But when I looked back, they were exactly as they'd been before, still and silent. I reached the end of the car, where an old intercom speaker crackled to life. A distorted voice, garbled and low, muttered something I couldn't understand. The sound sent shivers down my arms. "Hello?" I said, stepping closer to the speaker. "Where is this train going?" The voice responded, the words clearer now. "Next stop, Reichenbach." Reichenbach? I had never heard of it before. I'd studied Berlin's U-Bahn map enough times to know there was no station by that name. I moved to the next car, hoping to find someone or something with answers. This car was darker, the lights flickering more erratically. The metallic smell was stronger, almost suffocating now. Then I saw it. A small plaque bolted to the wall near the door. The lettering was faded, but I could just make out the words, Berliner Geisterbahnhof, Linie 13. Line 13 didn't exist. The train slowed, the screech of its brakes louder and more grating than before. A station loomed into view through the grimy windows, its outline barely visible in the dim light. The sign above the platform was cracked and faded, but I could still read the word etched into the surface. Reichenbach. The doors opened with a groan. A cold, hollow wind swept inside, carrying whispers that made my skin crawl. I should have stayed on the train. I should have waited for it to turn back. But something about that empty platform beckoned me. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I stepped off. The platform was like stepping into another world. The air felt thick, heavy and damp, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. The dim, flickering lights above cast long, jagged shadows that danced across the cracked walls. The station seemed ancient, as though it had been abandoned for decades or longer. The sound of the train behind me faded into the distance, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I turned, expecting to see the train lingering at the platform, but it was gone. No rumble of tracks, no receding lights, just the oppressive quiet. I was alone. The platform stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with broken benches and faded advertisements from a time I couldn't place. The walls were covered in graffiti, though not the kind you'd find on a regular subway. These markings were intricate and chaotic, spiraling symbols and strange characters that made my head ache the longer I looked at them. I called out, my voice echoing down the empty station. "Hello? Is anyone here?" The only response was the whisper of the wind. A staircase loomed ahead, leading down into the bowels of the station. The thought of descending into the unknown made my legs feel weak, but there was nowhere else to go. The tracks behind me stretched into endless darkness, and the walls felt as though they were closing in. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair. The descent felt endless. The further I went, the darker it became, until the faint glow from the platform above was nothing more than a memory. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back at me in distorted waves. Halfway down I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from below. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, and growing louder with each step I took. I froze, straining to see through the darkness. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that sent chills racing down my spine. "Warum bist du hier?" A voice rasped. The words echoed eerily, their meaning clear despite my rusty German. "Why are you here?" I gripped the railing tightly, my breath shallow. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whisper didn't respond. Instead, the tapping resumed, this time faster, closer. I couldn't turn back. My legs moved on their own, carrying me deeper into the shadows. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a cavernous space that looked nothing like a subway station. The walls were rough, carved from stone, and the floor was uneven, slick with moisture. A faint light glowed in the distance, drawing me toward it like a moth to a flame. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against my ears, making my heart pound louder. As I approached the light, I realized it wasn't coming from an electric bulb or a torch. It was something else entirely, a pulsating, unnatural glow emanating from deep within the cavern. And then I saw it, a shadow, tall and misshapen, moving against the light. The shadow moved slowly, deliberately, casting long, jagged shapes on the walls of the cavern. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I stood frozen, watching as the figure emerged into the faint glow. It wasn't human. Not entirely. The passenger, if I could call it that, had the outline of a person, but its limbs were elongated, almost grotesque. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, or the voids where eyes should have been, glimmered faintly in the dim light. Behind it, more figures began to appear, stepping forward one by one. They moved silently, their feet making no sound against the damp stone floor. Each one looked different, yet equally distorted, as if they'd been molded by hands unfamiliar with human anatomy. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. The cavern seemed to shrink around me as the silent passengers approached. They didn't hurry, didn't lunge. They simply walked, their empty gazes locked on me. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The echo of my words faded into the oppressive silence, and for a moment they stopped. My heart hammered in my chest as their heads tilted in unison, as though they were listening. Then, as if in response, the whispers began again. This time, they came from all around me, low and guttural, blending into an eerie chorus. I couldn't understand the words, but the malice in them was unmistakable. The shadows loomed closer. Desperation clawed at my chest as I searched for an escape. My eyes darted toward a narrow passageway at the edge of the cavern, barely visible in the faint glow. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The moment I moved, the whispers grew louder, angrier. The figures didn't chase me. They didn't need to. Their presence was like a weight pressing down on me, sapping my strength with every step. I stumbled into the passageway, the walls closing in around me. The air was colder here, biting against my skin. The sound of my own breathing drowned out everything else, but I could still feel them, those passengers, watching me, waiting. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading me further into the unknown. The whispers faded, replaced by the rhythmic tapping I'd heard before. It echoed down the passage, coming from somewhere ahead. I hesitated, torn between facing whatever lay at the end of the tunnel or risking another encounter with the silent passengers behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pressed forward, my hands brushing against the damp, uneven walls for balance. The tapping grew louder, more erratic, until it was all I could hear. Then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it. A single chair sitting in the middle of the passageway, and on it sat a figure cloaked in shadow, its head bowed, its hands resting on its knees. The tapping was coming from its foot, which moved in a steady rhythm against the stone floor. I stopped, unable to look away. Slowly, the figure raised its head, revealing a face I recognized all too well. It was mine. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure in the chair, me, stared with a blank, hollow expression. Its eyes, though identical to mine, held no life, no spark. The rhythmic tapping of its foot stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though I already knew the answer. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it raised one hand and pointed down the passageway. The motion was slow, deliberate, as though urging me towards something I couldn't yet see. I wanted to run, but my legs betrayed me. Compelled by something I couldn't explain, I moved forward, my gaze locked on the figure's unblinking eyes until I passed it. The chair creaked faintly as I left it behind, the sound echoing ominously in the narrow space. The passageway widened, opening into another platform. This one was entirely unlike the station I'd left behind. The tiles were cracked and discolored, the walls covered in a thick layer of grime. Dim, flickering lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows that danced with every sway of their light. Above me, a sign creaked as it swung gently on rusted chains. The letters spelled out a single word: End Station. End Station. The word hit me like a blow. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration. This was the end of the line in every sense. The platform was empty, save for a single train car sitting on the tracks. Unlike the ghostly train I had boarded earlier, this car was old and rusted, its windows shattered and its paint peeling. The door stood ajar, revealing only darkness inside. I hesitated, glancing back the way I'd come. The passageway behind me was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. There was no going back. A faint sound broke the silence, a low, mournful whistle, as though the train itself were calling to me. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I stepped onto the platform and approached the car. As I climbed inside, the air grew colder, heavier. The interior was barren, stripped of seats and fixtures. Only a single lantern hung from the ceiling, its flame flickering weakly. The door behind me slammed shut, sealing me inside. Then, the train lurched forward. It moved slowly at first, the wheels screeching against the tracks. Through the shattered windows, I saw the platform disappear into the darkness, replaced by an endless tunnel. The walls outside were etched with the same strange symbols I'd seen earlier, glowing faintly as we passed. And then I heard it again, the whispers. They came from all around me, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't angry this time. They were pleading, desperate, as though they were trying to warn me. But it was too late. Ahead, a faint light appeared, growing brighter with each passing second. The train picked up speed, hurtling toward the light with a force that pressed me against the wall. As we burst into the brightness, I realized it wasn't an exit or a station. It was something else entirely, a void, vast and endless, filled with shadows and shapes that defied comprehension. The whispers became screams, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the train. The overwhelming darkness had lifted, replaced by a harsh, artificial light above me. My body ached and my head throbbed as if I'd just woken from a long, restless sleep. For a moment I thought I had imagined everything, the strange station, the silent passengers, the train that never should have existed. But something wasn't right. I slowly sat up, blinking against the bright fluorescent lights overhead. I was in a small, sterile room, the kind you'd find in a hospital or an interrogation room. The walls were white and cold, and the door was closed, locked with a simple, unmarked handle. I checked my surroundings, my heart pounding. The sound of my breath filled the air, but other than that, the room was silent, too silent. Then I noticed it. On the table next to me was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I reached for it, trembling as I unfolded it. The note was simple, written in neat handwriting. Don't believe it. They never let you go. My blood ran cold as I read those words over and over, the meaning sinking in. I didn't know who had left it, but it felt as though they had known exactly what I had experienced. The train, the eerie station, the passengers. I wasn't sure if I had escaped. I stood shakily, pressing my hand against the cold wall for support. The door was the only exit, but it felt wrong, like a trap. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, but curiosity gnawed at my resolve. What if this was all part of the twisted game I had unknowingly entered? As I approached the door, I hesitated. Then, with a forceful push, I turned the handle. It opened. I stepped into a narrow, dimly lit corridor that stretched on indefinitely. The walls seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, shifting in subtle ways I couldn't fully grasp. The floor was uneven, and the air had a faint, metallic taste, just like the train. My pulse quickened as I realized I wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed behind me, soft, deliberate. They grew louder, closer. I didn't need to turn around to know that the silent passengers had followed me, trailing behind in the shadows. Their presence was a weight on my shoulders, pressing down, suffocating me. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to escape. I had to. I didn't look back, but I could hear them, whispers, barely audible, urging me forward, urging me deeper into the unknown. The corridor twisted, bent, and I lost all sense of direction. The world felt like it was folding in on itself. And then I saw it. At the far end of the corridor was another door. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling through the gap. My heart leaped at the sight of it. Freedom. I sprinted toward it, my feet pounding against the floor, faster and faster, until I was almost at the threshold. But before I could reach it, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I froze, a scream lodged in my throat. Turning slowly, I found myself face to face with the figure from the train, the one I had seen in the chair. Its eyes were empty, hollow, but this time I saw something else in them. Something familiar. It was me. The hand tightened, its grip cold and unyielding. The figure opened its mouth, and from its lips I heard the words, "You'll never leave. Not really." The light behind the door flickered, then disappeared. The corridor closed in on me as I struggled to break free from the grip. But no matter how hard I pulled, the shadow of the figure loomed over me, dragging me back into the darkness. and then everything went black. I woke with a sharp gasp, my entire body drenched in cold sweat. My heart raced, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, or what had just happened. But one thing was certain, I wasn't alone. The room was dark, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. As I slowly tried to sit up, my hands brushed against something soft yet unyielding. The ground beneath me wasn't solid like the cold stone of the corridor or the metal of the train. It was damp, almost like I was lying on old fabric or moldy carpet. The scent of earth and decay filled my nostrils as I cautiously looked around. I was still in a room, but it felt different. The walls seemed to be breathing, shifting, expanding, and contracting as though they were alive. The faint whispers that had haunted me in the darkness now filled the air, low and indistinct. I strained to listen, but the words were fragmented, impossible to understand. Yet there was a sense of urgency in them, an insistence that made my skin crawl. The whispers seemed to come from all around me. I pressed my hands against the walls, feeling their cool, uneven surfaces beneath my fingertips. A shiver ran through me as a low hum resonated from within the walls themselves. "Please," I froze. The whisper was clear this time, a voice, soft, desperate, pleading. It didn't sound like the distorted, faceless figures I had encountered before. This voice was familiar. "Don't go." I stood up shakily, the whispers growing louder, the air growing heavier with each passing second. The walls seemed to close in on me, squeezing tighter as though the entire room was alive, aware of my every movement. "Please, help me." The voice echoed again, clearer than before. It was coming from the wall in front of me. Slowly, cautiously, I placed my hand on the surface. The hum intensified, vibrating beneath my touch. Suddenly, the wall beneath my fingers began to shift. I pulled my hand away in alarm as a low groan reverberated through the air. The whispers became frantic, rising in pitch until they sounded like a chorus of tortured souls, all pleading for something. But what? I stepped back, my mind racing. What was this place? Was it some kind of trap? And who or what was speaking to me from the walls? The door to the room was still there, standing slightly ajar, but the sense of dread in my chest prevented me from rushing toward it. The whispers kept pulling me back, urging me to stay, to listen. Against my better judgment, I approached the wall where the voice had come from. My hand hovered over the surface, trembling. I could almost feel something waiting for me behind it, something that wanted me to listen, to understand. The hum grew louder, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. And then, as if in response, the wall seemed to peel away, revealing a dark, endless void beyond it. "No one leaves." The voice from the wall spoke again, more forcefully this time. I recoiled in horror, stumbling back. The space before me swirled with darkness, as if the room itself was collapsing into some vast, infinite pit. The walls groaned, the floor trembled beneath my feet, and I realized this was no ordinary place. It was a prison, a trap, and I had no idea how to escape. I looked around wildly, trying to make sense of the situation. The whispers were now deafening, reverberating through my skull, pushing me closer to the edge of the void. I turned back to the door, my only remaining option, and bolted toward it. As I approached, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I wasn't alone. I didn't dare look back. My hand gripped the doorknob, twisting it open. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I felt the cold hand of something or someone brush against my shoulder. But when I turned to confront whatever it was, there was nothing there. I was alone, or so I thought. I ran. I ran without thinking, my heart pounding in my chest, the cold air rushing past me as I sprinted down the narrow, dimly lit tunnel. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls, blending with the faint whispers that seemed to follow me wherever I went. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, inch by inch. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, but no matter how far I went, the air felt heavier, colder. The sense of being watched grew more intense with every passing second. Like unseen eyes were tracking my every move. The whispers, soft at first, had become loud, unintelligible shouts. They seemed to be coming from every direction, surrounding me. "Don't leave," they urged. "You can't escape." I pressed my hands against the sides of the tunnel, trying to steady myself, but it only made the unease inside me grow. Every inch of the space felt wrong, like something was lurking just beyond my vision, waiting to pounce. And then I saw it. At the far end of the tunnel, a faint light flickered, almost like a candle's flame. It was strange, out of place. The rest of the tunnel was dark, suffocating, but this light, it seemed to beckon me. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity and the feeling that it was my only chance pulled me forward. As I drew closer to the light, I saw the shape of a figure standing still, half shrouded in shadow. My breath caught in my throat. Was it one of the passengers? Another dark figure from the station? Or something else entirely? I hesitated, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It remained motionless, its back to me, its head slightly turned as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. I took another step forward, then another. Suddenly the figure turned, its face now visible in the dim light. It was me. I froze in terror, my blood running cold. The face before me was mine, but distorted, hollow, as if the life had been drained from it. Its eyes were dark, empty, staring straight into my soul. I staggered back, a scream lodged in my throat. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling in the oppressive silence of the tunnel. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it raised a finger, pointing directly at me. I felt an unnatural chill spread through my body as the figure slowly began to approach. Each step it took echoed in the tunnel, slow and deliberate. The whispers around me grew louder, more insistent, as though they were warning me, no, begging me to run. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my body refusing to obey my frantic commands. The figure stopped just in front of me, its empty eyes locked onto mine. And then, in a voice that sounded like my own, it spoke. "You can't leave. You never could." The words sent a shiver through my entire being. Before I could respond, the figure reached out with its cold, lifeless hand, gripping my wrist with an iron-like force. The moment its fingers made contact, the world around me seemed to shudder, the walls of the tunnel trembling as if the very foundation of reality was cracking beneath us. The tunnel stretched and twisted, distorting into something wrong. The air thickened, swirling around me, pulling me in every direction. I could no longer see the end of the tunnel, no longer hear the whispers. All that remained was an overwhelming darkness and the sound of my own frantic breathing. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The figure held me firmly in place, its grip tightening with each passing second. It was as though I were being drawn into the very heart of the darkness, into a place where no one could find me. And then I saw it, the thing I had feared all along. A glowing symbol appeared in front of me, burning with an unholy light. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, an intricate design, full of sharp angles and twisted lines, glowing in the air as if it were alive. The figure's voice echoed again, this time filled with a chilling certainty. "This is where you belong now." The light from the symbol intensified, and the world around me began to fade. The tunnel, the figure, the very ground beneath my feet, all of it was swallowed by the blinding light. I tried to resist, tried to fight, but it was hopeless. The darkness consumed me. I don't know how long I was trapped in that darkness. Time lost all meaning as I was pulled deeper into the void. The last thing I remembered was the blinding light of the symbol, and then, nothing. But as the darkness started to recede, something else began to take form. Images, snippets of memories that weren't mine, flashes of a life I couldn't recall, yet somehow I knew. I saw a city, an ancient place, with cobblestone streets and buildings that reached the sky. People walked past, their faces distorted, but they carried a strange familiarity. As I watched them, the pieces of the puzzle began to click together. They weren't just any people. They were me. There were other glimpses, of faces I thought I had forgotten, of places I had never been, and of memories that didn't belong to this world. It was as if I had lived multiple lives, scattered through time, and each fragment was trying to tell me something. I tried to focus, to make sense of the vision, but it was fleeting, slipping through my fingers like smoke. And then I understood. The tunnel, the train, the strange station, it was all connected to something far older than I could have imagined. This wasn't a new reality, a new world. No. It was a place out of time, a world that had been lost, buried beneath layers of history, a history that had been erased, forgotten. This place, this endless maze of tunnels and forgotten tracks, wasn't just a physical space, it was a memory. a place where lost histories lingered, trapped in the forgotten corners of time. And I was part of it. I didn't belong here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a trap. It was a place where the echoes of the past sought to anchor those who had wandered into it. The voices in the walls, the strange symbols, the distorted figures, it was all a manifestation of this twisted history, calling to me, holding me captive in its endless cycle. I had to find a way out. But how could I escape when everything around me was part of a history I couldn't even comprehend? I could feel the presence of someone watching me. The whispers had quieted, but the weight of their silence was deafening. And then I heard a voice, clear, familiar, and unmistakable. "You can't leave." I turned, and there it was, the figure from the train, the one with the hollow eyes, the one who had been with me through this entire ordeal. But now, it wasn't just standing there. It was smiling. Its eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. "This place has been waiting for you, just as it has for all who enter." I took a step back, my heart racing. What is this place? The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. A place forgotten by time. A place where memories are trapped, where history never ends, and now you are part of it. I shook my head, backing away. "No, I don't belong here. I won't stay." The figure's smile grew wider, its voice colder. "You never had a choice. The moment you entered this world, you became part of its story. There is no leaving now." I could feel the walls closing in again, the darkness creeping in from every side. The tunnel, the city, the lost history, they were all folding in on me, wrapping around me like chains. But something deep inside me refused to accept it. I had to fight. With every ounce of strength, I forced myself to turn and run, even as the darkness reached for me, as the whispers grew louder. I wasn't going to let it end like this. As I ran, I caught one last glimpse of the figure, still standing there, watching, waiting, and I realized the truth. This was no ordinary place. It was a prison of time, a world where the past and present were forever intertwined. And I was a part of it now. I kept running, my legs burning, my breath ragged as I sprinted through the tunnel. But no matter how fast I moved, the oppressive darkness seemed to follow me, closing in tighter with every step. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if something was weighing down on my chest, pushing the very life out of me. Then I saw it. At the end of the tunnel, a faint light flickered, like a distant star in an endless void. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to go back, but there was no other way. I had to reach the light. With each step, the light grew brighter. And as I neared it, I saw something, or rather, someone, standing there, waiting for me. It was the station master. The same figure I had glimpsed earlier, standing silently in the shadows. But now, he was standing in the light, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, as though he had been waiting for me all along. I stopped just a few feet from him, breathing heavily. He made no move, no attempt to acknowledge my presence. But I could feel the weight of his gaze, even though I couldn't see his eyes. "You shouldn't have come," the station master said, his voice low and gravelly. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. "What is this place?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his heavy boots echoing off the walls of the tunnel. He was unnervingly calm, like someone who had seen the same tragedy play out 1,000 times. "This station," he began, his voice carrying a strange sorrow, "is not a place for those like you. It's a place for those who were lost, those who belong to the past." "Lost?" I repeated, trying to make sense of his words. "What do you mean?" The station master didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned away, his silhouette sharp against the dim light. "You've seen what's in the walls, the whispers, the memories, the faces that aren't yours but are." I nodded, a chill running down my spine. "I've heard them, the voices. They're the voices of the ones who came before you," he said, his tone almost mournful. "They're trapped here, just as you will be if you don't leave. This station has no place for the living. It exists between worlds, between time, and now you're a part of it." I recoiled. "No, I won't stay. I can't. I have to go." The station master's lips curved into a grim smile. "You can try, but time moves differently here. You'll never leave, not unless you know the right way out." I stepped back, panic rising in my chest. "What do you mean? There has to be a way." The station master's expression grew serious. The exit doesn't exist in the way you think. The way out isn't a door, a tunnel, or a train. The way out is in your mind. The moment you understand that you're part of this station's story, that's when you'll see the truth. I shook my head, desperately trying to make sense of his cryptic words. I don't understand. How do I leave? You don't. The station master's voice was soft but final. The only choice you have is whether you accept it or not. If you do, you'll be here forever. If you don't, you'll fade into the station's history, just like the others. I felt my chest tighten as the reality of his words sank in. This wasn't just a strange place. It was a prison where time no longer mattered and where the past never truly let go. The station master seemed to sense my fear, his voice becoming gentler. I didn't want this for you, but you must understand, no one who enters here truly escapes. You may think you have free will, but this place has been pulling you for far longer than you know. I couldn't speak. My throat had gone dry, and my mind was racing, trying to comprehend the situation. How had I ended up here? Was it a dream, a nightmare? But the station master's words held a cold, undeniable truth. There was no escape. Before I could speak again, the station master raised a hand, motioning for silence. The train comes soon, but this time it won't be for you. I looked around, panic rising as the sound of a distant train echoed through the tunnel. The ground beneath me shook as the tracks groaned in response, and I knew the train was coming again. But this time, there was no escape. Goodbye, the station master said, his figure fading into the shadows as the train grew closer. Remember, this is where you belong. The train arrived just as the station master had predicted, a low, rumbling sound vibrating through the tunnel. The air thickened, and the faint flicker of the overhead lights dimmed as the train came into view. The train itself was unlike any I had seen before, old-fashioned, with gleaming brass fixtures and windows that were just too dark to see through. I stood frozen at the edge of the platform, my breath caught in my throat. The sound of the train's wheels scraping along the track seemed to slow, stretching the time between each turn of the wheel. It was as if everything around me had slowed to a crawl, the world thickening with anticipation. As the train came to a halt, the doors opened, but no one got off. No passengers, no conductors, no sound of people shifting or moving. It was empty. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't right. I could feel the weight of the station master's warning hanging in the air. The station wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a place where time itself had become distorted. And now I was standing at the edge of a train that, for all I knew, might be the only thing that could take me back. But the question was, would it? With no other choice, I stepped forward, the echo of my footsteps louder than ever before. The doors of the train slid open with a low metallic hiss, and I walked inside. The silence inside was suffocating, the smell of old wood and dust heavy in the air. I glanced around at the empty seats, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes drifted to the far side of the carriage, where a clock hung on the wall. The clock was strange, an old-fashioned grandfather clock with an ornate face and delicate hands. But as I looked closer, my stomach churned. The hands of the clock weren't moving, they weren't ticking. The time was stuck at exactly 12. I blinked, staring at the clock in disbelief. How could that be? Every clock I'd seen before had kept time, no matter how strange the situation. But this one was different. The hands were frozen in place, caught in an eternal loop, as though time itself had given up. Suddenly, the train jolted forward, the familiar sound of the wheels on the tracks becoming louder, more urgent. I stumbled slightly, my heart pounding as the train began to pick up speed, rushing into the dark, endless tunnel ahead. The walls blurred around me, becoming nothing more than shadow. I sat down in one of the empty seats, gripping the armrest tightly, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The train was moving faster now, the hum of the engine vibrating through the floor beneath me. But something felt off. Something was wrong. I looked back at the clock. It hadn't moved. The hands were still stuck at 12. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible ticking. It was coming from the clock, but the hands were still stuck, unmoving, as though mocking the sound. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't a normal sound. It wasn't the ticking of a clock. It was something deeper, something other. A slow, methodical beat, like the ticking of a clock in a place where time didn't exist. The train continued to hurtle through the tunnel, and the ticking grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the clock was alive, beating in sync with my pulse, drawing me deeper into the unknown. The sound of the ticking became all I could hear, drowning out everything else, the rush of the train, the rushing wind, even my own breath. It was as if the clock had taken control, and I was powerless to stop it. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the ticking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear nothing. No wheels turning, no breath, no heartbeat. Just an overwhelming emptiness that pressed in from every side. And then the train stopped. I looked up, my heart racing as I glanced around. The tunnel was gone. The train had come to a halt in an empty, darkened space. There were no walls, no platform, just endless inky blackness stretching out in every direction. The clock on the wall had finally moved, but it was no longer stuck at 12. It was now stuck at 12:01. A chill ran through me as I realized what had happened. The train, the clock, the time, it wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about being trapped in a cycle that never ended, a clock that would never move forward, a train that would never stop. I looked out the window, trying to see anything in the void beyond, but all I saw were my own reflections, distorted and warped in the glass. The train hadn't taken me anywhere. It had brought me back here, back to where time never moved. And now, it was my turn to wait, to become another lost part of this station's forgotten history. The clock ticked again, and the train began to move once more. The train began to move again, its wheels grinding against the tracks with an unsettling, rhythmic sound. I could feel the vibration beneath me, the air growing colder with each passing moment. The silence was broken only by the faint, distorted ticking of the clock, still stuck at 12:01, echoing through the carriage like the beating of a trapped heart. I sat frozen in my seat, staring out of the window, desperate for any glimpse of something, anything, that might signal an end to this nightmare. But all I saw was the same black void that stretched endlessly in all directions. Then, a sudden shift. I felt a presence, a cold, heavy feeling in the air, as if the very atmosphere around me had changed. It wasn't just the train that had moved. It was something deeper, something more profound. It was as if the station itself, the train, and everything in this strange world had begun to shift, to change in ways I couldn't understand. I turned my head, my eyes scanning the empty seats, looking for any sign of life. And that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the glass, there was a figure standing at the end of the carriage. It was the station master. He stood perfectly still, his face obscured by the same wide-brimmed hat, his posture as rigid as before. But this time, there was something different about him. His presence seemed heavier, more menacing, as though he was no longer a guide but something far darker. The moment I locked eyes with his reflection, my breath caught in my throat. He spoke without moving, his voice barely a whisper, but it felt like it was echoing in my mind. "You've been chosen." The words sent a shiver down my spine. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what he meant. Chosen for what? The station master slowly raised his hand, pointing directly at me, his fingers long and skeletal, like they were meant to point through me rather than at me. "Everything here is connected," he said, his voice growing more and more distant. "The train, the station, the clock, they're all part of the same story, a story that never ends." I looked down at the clock again. 12:01. It hadn't moved. It never would. "You were meant to find this place," he continued, "and now you'll never leave. Time doesn't work the same here. Not for you, not for me, not for anyone. This station, this world is a place of memory, and once you've entered, you're a part of it forever." I could feel the weight of his words, crushing me with their gravity. I had come here looking for an answer, but all I had found was more confusion, more questions. I stood up, trembling. "What do you want from me?" The station master took a step forward, his figure slowly disappearing into the shadows, his voice trailing off. "Nothing. But the station needs you. It needs someone to remember." As he spoke, I noticed the walls of the train car warping. The light flickered, and for just a moment, the reflection in the window wasn't mine anymore. It was another face, someone I didn't recognize, someone whose eyes stared back at me with hollow, lifeless intent. I gasped, stumbling backward. I had to get off this train. I had to escape. But just as I turned to run toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening sound, trapping me inside. I heard the station master's voice again, clearer this time, as though he was standing directly behind me. "You're not meant to leave, not anymore." I spun around, my heart racing, but the train was empty again. The station master was gone. The reflections in the glass had returned to normal, showing only my own terrified face. But then something changed. The train slowed, and with that change I heard it, a faint ticking sound, not from the clock, but from the very walls themselves. Tick, tick, tick. It was a maddening rhythm, louder now like a countdown. My mind raced, panic overtaking me as I realized the truth. The time here wasn't just frozen. It was moving in its own way, its own pace. And whatever was coming, I didn't know if I was ready. The ticking grew louder, and suddenly the train jerked to a stop again. This time there was no distant darkness beyond the windows. Instead, I saw a small, dimly lit platform stretching out in front of me. And standing on it, waiting, was someone I hadn't expected. Myself. The reflection in the window wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was me, alive, standing on the platform, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't read. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The train doors opened, and my other self, the other me, stepped forward. "You found the truth," the reflection said in a voice that sounded like my own but colder. "But you'll never escape it. You're part of the story now." The doors slammed shut again, and the train began to move once more. I sat back down, trembling in my seat, staring at the clock that was still stuck at 12:01. The hands of the clock hadn't moved, and I realized with a horrifying certainty that neither would I. The train rumbled back into motion, its wheels screeching against the tracks as if resisting the journey ahead. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. That eerie reflection of myself standing on the platform, alive, looking back at me, haunted every inch of my thoughts. I could still feel the cold weight of the words, "You're part of the story now." I glanced around the carriage, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to me like a thick fog. The station master's words echoed in my head, looping in a never-ending cycle. "The station needs you. It needs someone to remember." A part of me wanted to scream, to bang on the windows, to beg for help, but I knew no one could hear me. There was no one left. The train wasn't going to stop at a real station. The station wasn't real. I needed to find a way out, but every time I tried to think, the answer seemed just out of reach. The longer I stayed here, the more I felt like I was losing myself. The walls were closing in, the clock ticking endlessly. The train was my cage, and the station was my tomb. And yet I couldn't stop moving forward. The train's sudden halt threw me off balance, and I almost fell from my seat. I grabbed onto the armrest, my breath shallow, my mind reeling from the exhaustion of it all. I had no idea how long I had been trapped in this place. Was it hours, days, weeks? It didn't matter. Time no longer made sense. When I glanced out the window, I expected nothing but the same void of blackness. But this time, something was different. A faint light flickered on the horizon, just a glimmer at first, barely noticeable. But as the train slowed, it grew brighter, more distinct. The train was approaching a station? A real station? My pulse quickened as I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. Could this be it? Could this be my escape? The train came to a complete stop, the screeching of the brakes rattling my teeth. The doors slid open, and the faint glow of the station lights spilled into the carriage. I didn't wait. I rushed toward the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could almost taste freedom, feel it just beyond my fingertips. I stepped onto the platform, my feet landing on solid ground. The air was cool, fresh, almost familiar. I turned, looking around for any sign of life, any hint that I was no longer in the strange, twisted world of the ghost station. But as I stepped farther into the station, a cold breeze whipped through the air, causing the station's overhead lights to flicker. My heart raced. Something wasn't right. A voice broke the silence, low and unsettling, coming from somewhere deep in the shadows. "You think you can leave?" the voice asked. It was the station master's voice. He was here. I froze. My skin prickled, every hair on the back of my neck standing up. "You can never leave. You belong here now." The station master stepped into the light, his face cold, lifeless, as if made of stone. His eyes locked with mine, and the dread that filled me was suffocating. No, no, I'm not staying, I whispered to myself. I'm leaving. This ends now. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the platform as I sprinted toward the end, hoping for any sign of an exit, a way back to the real world. But the shadows seemed to stretch further and further, swallowing the light, trapping me in an endless maze. The station master's voice echoed through the emptiness. You think running will save you? The train is always here. It never leaves. I glanced over my shoulder, and in that brief moment, I saw it. The train, the ghostly train I had just escaped from, was slowly pulling back into the station, its lights dim and cold, the doors open, waiting for me to return. I gasped, my heart pounding louder than ever. I had to escape. I had to get away from this place before it consumed me completely. I reached the far end of the station, a narrow alley leading into the blackness beyond. There was no time to think. I didn't even look back. I ran. The station master's voice grew fainter with each step, but the ground beneath me began to shake. The tunnel seemed to close in. The walls crept inward, the shadows pulling at me like tendrils of darkness. I pushed forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My legs were growing weaker, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. The faintest sliver of light. A door, cracked open just enough to show the world beyond. I lunged for it, throwing myself through the door and into the light. But as I crossed the threshold, I felt the world around me shift. A flash of memory, of moments that weren't mine. The station master's cold stare, the eerie ticking of the clock, the endless train rides, and then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back at the station, but this time I was alone. No train, no station master, no walls closing in, just silence. I was free. But at what cost? The clock on the wall still read 12:01, its hands frozen in time, as if mocking me. The train had stopped moving, but something told me it was only waiting for someone else to get on. And this time, I wouldn't be there to stop it. The door to the train opened once again. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt once more. The lights went out entirely. A cold gust of air swept through the carriage, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. A deep sense of dread washed over me as the passengers, those silent, lifeless figures, slowly turned to face me. Their hollow eyes locked onto mine, cold and empty, like they were waiting for something. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and the only thing I could do was stare back at them, paralyzed with fear. Then, the train doors opened with an eerie creak. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. I stepped toward the doorway, my body trembling. What awaited me on the other side was worse than anything I could have imagined. The station outside was nothing like any I had seen before. The platform stretched endlessly, lined with old, crumbling buildings, shadows moving in the corners like something alive. It was a place stuck in time, a place that no one was meant to see. That's when I heard it again, the voice. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, sharp, like a warning. You've uncovered Berlin's truth, it said, and now you'll never leave. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was the train's sign, flickering above the open doors. Berlin's hidden truth. Then everything went black. If you find it interesting, please like and comment to let me know what is missing so that I have the motivation to make more videos like this. Thank you, everyone.